Okay, everybody, thank you for coming back to the Xanadu Review. As always, my name is Prester John Andrews, but you can just call me PJ. So today with me, I have a very interesting and thoughtful writer on Substack who goes by the name of, Eurydice. And I'll kind of let her talk about it, what the beat she covers, but she's kind of one of my favorite writers because she takes very difficult topics and that I guess you could sometimes call like uh, culture war type stuff, but she does it in such a thoughtful and interesting way that you can just find such an interesting way of looking at it. So, yeah, if you want to tell the audience a little bit about yourself and your writing, and we'll get into it.
Wow, thank you so much. I appreciate that. I'm not sure I can say anything about my writing that would be better than that wonderful, gracious introduction. Thank you.
No problem.
I write about things that interest me, which means that I end up covering a wide array of topics. I'm not covering everything necessarily, but I do end up siloing a lot on things like scientific questions that I find interesting, math questions that I find interesting, and then, yeah, a lot of topics on gender and culture, politics occasionally, although I try not to lean into that too much. And mostly I write what I think is interesting, and I try to write as honestly and as fairly as I can, which sometimes works out and sometimes doesn't. I think of my writing as a work in progress.
Yeah, same for me. I just kind of do what I find interesting, and I am, stunned and humbled, still to this day that anybody reads it. And I think that's, not to, do the cliche thing of, praising Substack as a platform, but it is kind of an interesting thing. I don't know if you want to say your rough age range, but I came online kind of at the very beginning of the blogosphere age, and it does kind of have that vibe to me right now where you can just kind of do your own little weird idiosyncratic thing.
I love that about it. I definitely have memories of some of the tail end of the blogosphere, and I've missed it. I certainly read plenty of that as a teenager, and Substack is easy to praise, in my opinion. It's cool to have an easy platform for blogging as opposed to short form content, video content.
Yeah, I think and again, not to like go too much into the praising of the platform itself, unless Chris or Mills or any of those other guys want to pay us.
Of course, always accepting.
But yeah, no,
donations.
It's cool that you are able to see a return of the longer form content that is. And I don't know if it's just a flash in the pan, just because it seems to be like on the ups right now, but you're seeing a lot of like celebrities and people like that come on. And I think it's kind of heartening that there seems to be at least some kind of appetite for longer form content.
Yes, I genuinely enjoy the ramshackle collection of types of blog you can find on Substack, and especially the fact that there are celebrities, big names, big interesting bloggers, people that I've been reading again since I was a teenager, as well as everyday people who write on the side, write for fun. It is a really interesting space. I really like participating in Substack and writing my own blog.
Yeah, and I think you do Twitter as well, right?
I am on and off Twitter.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
My Twitter presence was the first place that I used the Eurydice handle. And when I started a Substack, I didn't really have a good reason to use a different persona because I wasn't interested in using a real name blog for a lot of reasons. So I just ported the handle and the profile picture over from Twitter, and then promptly stopped using Twitter most of the time. And so there are some weeks where I'm on Twitter, and a lot of the time my account is deactivated. So it's both.
Probably for the best. Because I've tried one or two times to try to get on there just because, like, I'm I want to try to like, since I'm gaining a little bit of traction as a writer and podcast, just, I might as well just like try to promote on there. But like, I feel like I lose brain cells every time I log on. So, but I was just asking because I it seems like maybe that's kind of the experience of Twitter too, where you have, I guess, X now or whatever, that you have like, Hitler, Groiper 420 right next to like, Norman Padhor. It's kind of because believe it or not, like before Substack, I wasn't really a social media guy. Like, we're talking about like the early blogosphere days, or for me, it was like old school internet forums and message boards and stuff before social media. And then, I did Facebook and MySpace a little bit, but then, deleted it over 10 years ago at this point. So I don't know if that was the Twitter experience, but it's very interesting to see the mix of people you'll get. And 'cause I posted something recently about like, you know, not to get too off into a tangent in politics stuff. I was like, if you really want to deal with illegal immigration, the best way to do it is, go after the employers. And if that was the case, I would join, if that's who ICE was going after, I would join up and I'd be like Christoph Waltz and Glorious Bastards. I had one person was like, how could you say something so insensitive and like, make light of the Nazis? And another person was like, how could you be mean to the Nazis like that? Typical liberal. And it's like, it takes all kinds.
They certainly get all kinds. They really do.
But anyway, that's maybe kind of a good lead into the first thing that I wanted to talk to you about is there's an article, another fellow Substacker, friend of the show, Ancient Problems, wrote called, why is there so much gender slop all of a sudden? And I think, I use that term, kind of cheekily, since I think what you do is very thoughtful, but that is like the general term that's used, like the gender slop, because a lot of it can be very libidinal and very thoughtful ways. But I guess at first, like, ask you the question, while it does really feel like in the last couple of years, the gender of his really like in the height of like, the sphere, blogosphere stuff, it's even more significant. So I guess to lead in, what you thought about, that the question, or like, the topic more broadly, because I do want to get into some of the specifics that you've talked about. But it feels kind of interesting to me that like now it's really boiling up.
That is an interesting thing. Especially because I remember when I actually first was on Twitter, I had sorted myself into a cluster of people that I was familiar with, had been familiar with from honestly previous iterations of Twitter. And they had particular norms and standards. And I tweeted an observation about the experience of beauty and being a woman in dating and what it means that beauty is so important as a woman who's dating men at the time. And I got a massive reaction. This would have been the very end of 2021. And when I say massive, I mean relative to what I was expecting. I was a new account with not a lot of followers. I got hundreds of interactions on that tweet, which I was not expecting at all, because to me it was a rather banal observation. I didn't think I was going to get much reaction on it. And that has been a lot of my experience in talking about gender as I've gotten older and as I've shifted like different groups of people that I end up spending more time around, whether online or in person, that gender seems to be a more salient topic to people, even if you're making observations that are boring and old school. And I'm not positive why precisely that is. I can theorize about, people spending more time online, people having a lot more to say about the theory of gender and a lot less experience with the practice of it. But ultimately, I noticed the same kind of overall increase in people's tight interest in gender content in the last like 3 to 5 years. And it is sort of baffling. And I think there's sort of a market effect when it comes to the question of gender slop. Like, the most boring observation I could make about the question, why is there so much gender slop, all of a sudden, is that clearly the public rewards it. People are really interested in it, even really boring, like not that juicy observations about gender and sex. And I don't know why that is, but it does seem to be the case.
Yeah, I hear a lot of talk about like, how, Gen Z, for example, is like the most right wing or most left wing generation. And it seems to really slot on like a very, very hard gender divide.
Yeah.
And I think part of it is like, people not being embodied, but maybe also just maybe this is downstream of, what you could choose so many sources, COVID or people becoming more online, smartphones, what have you. But I think people will just become more and more tribalized on like very, very, very basic lines like that. Whereas, and you don't have to say exactly how old you are, if you want to preserve anonymity, but I'm getting the impression you're probably close to my age, like mid-30s ish. Am I off base there?
Within a few years, yeah.
Okay. So you grew up around the same age as me, where like I remember in like the 90s and 2000s, early 2000s when I was a kid, it was very like the end of history, but for gender. It was like the feminist thing was like you want to move away from gender differences, and that was the same kind of like cosmopolitan thing as a guy. Like the metrosexual was a big thing for a while.
Yeah.
And then it felt like, like the Tumblr, I don't want to say it, be tried to sound too dismissive, but like that very like disembodied, much more theoretical gender theory stuff became popular, but it was kind of fringe. But now it seems to me like when I see younger people, it's either they're really, really in on the doubling down on like non-binary gender or being androgynous, or they're men and women, like super, super hardcore um, gender differentials in a way that like you didn't really see. I feel like for our generation quite as much. It's like it's much more performative.
Yeah, it's hard for me to make sense of Gen Z as an actual phenomenon, because I know a few people in that actual age range, and then a lot of what I see is online, and obviously online gets filtered for extremism. But that kind of seems like its own contributor to the problem, like
Hmm.
if everybody is increasingly online, and if online channels select heavily for messages that are really extreme and obvious, then you will get increasing polarization on everything, basically, just downstream of that chain of events. You don't need anything else to increase the amount of sorting and specializing and intensifying that kind of system will provide for people.
Yeah, that could become self-reinforcing at a certain point for sure. But kind of related. So there was one article. I was reading a handful of your articles and a couple podcast appearances this morning to get prepared for it again. And it's something you're talking about, like the in like the context of like gender relationships and heterosexual relationships, like this. You were talking about like this like feminine or female desire for like a learned helplessness. And it was an interesting way of looking at it, since I remember messaging you before this. And you were talking about like, because I've called it like I'm just a girl feminism, which to me seems like a really, really weird thing to see, because like that was just like so antithetical to like even just like the mainstream before, like, the toxic dynamics that we see now associated with the term, but like 90s girl power stuff.
Yes.
But it does seem very like you're just trying to like give up on decisions and you could just fall back on it. And the thing that I messaged you about, which I guess maybe was me reading into, is like, the immature male side of it that you see ending up with women like that is what I think I said something along the lines of like, the narciss like male narcissism of, wanting to be Prince Charming. And it's interesting. I don't know if you want to expand on that, because, I'm kind of doing my half-assed way of trying to relate what you wrote. So if you want to talk about what that concept is a little bit more, and we can kind of go back and forth on it.
No, not at all. That's a generally pretty faithful summary. The major difference that I have with your wording would be referring to the male side as narcissism per se. It's not like there isn't a narcissistic version of the immature male pattern, because there generally is for a lot of especially limited or immature patterns. But I think the male side is usually rather defensible at its heart, and it gets applied in unwise ways, usually for those who are immature, insecure, more given to stress or anxiety. And that is this desire to be needed and this desire to be indispensable for your role in her life as a man to be something that she can't really live without, is connected to a sort of noble white knight instinct that I think a lot of men have. And I personally would say that the fact that this instinct exists is really good. It's certainly likely to be adaptive when you have a partner who's pregnant, for example, right? So like there's reason to believe that this is slightly biological, but it's definitely very common culturally, and it has good versions. But when men don't have a balance for themselves with, I need to be necessary to this woman, bad things can happen, including dating women who unambiguously need you, which often leads to dating women who are fragile, unstable, unwell, not capable of taking care of themselves. Obviously, everyone deserves love. But there is something that I think is unwise about even unconsciously like this, selecting for someone who's genuinely weak, because it means that they will have trouble leaving you. And that's not just something that's bad in an ambiguous moral sense, but it seems to me that it's likely bad for the development of the men in question, in part because partners like that tend to be worse partners to them and teach them some of the wrong lessons. They have trouble getting out of a cycle where they date unstable women. Those unstable women cause major problems, suffering in some cases for them. And they assume that this is just what women are like, when in fact that is what they're selecting for out of their own immaturity and insecurity. So, like I said, there certainly is a true narcissist version of that framework, for sure. But I think a lot of men are not really sure how to answer their own internal desire to be necessary to a woman. And they get into these pitfalls, and their framework doesn't account for how is my selection mechanism working as a man? And am I actually selecting for women who are making my life worse? Basically, I don't see a lot of analysis publicly that looks like that. I don't know. Maybe men are talking about this personally with their friends, with their dads. They could be. I don't know. But it's something I observe.
Yeah, well, I would tell you, but I mean, I've been sworn to secrecy on the secret man council when we talk about these things.
I know.
No, well, I just say narcissist. This is kind of like a self-critique, because when I was a young man, that was basically me for sure. That I'm happily married in a good relationship now, but as a teen and early 20s something, I definitely had a lot of bird with a broken wing type girlfriends who I would be, looking back on it, somewhere between like their dad and their therapist. And I would either break up with them because it would be like, it's nice at first. And then it's like, wow, this girl is like crying at my apartment because I showed up 15 minutes late when I said I was going to be back. Or it's like a Pygmalion thing where like, she gets her shit together and leaves me. It's like, I'm seeing these two patterns emerge over and over again. And, you get older and you get healthier ideally, but maybe that doesn't happen with everybody.
Right. I mean, I do, as I say in some of my writing, I try to use the word immature as a catch-all term for some of this because immaturity is unavoidable, at least in the general sense. You don't get away with growing up and learning stuff without going through a period where you don't know how stuff works and where you have to figure it out. And it is an important part of development to be able to identify patterns first and foremost, and then to start asking yourself how you're contributing to patterns that you don't like participating in. And it sounds like you did a very admirable job of identifying that.
Well, if you, at the very least, I don't like, maybe not the smartest guy in the world, but if you burn your hand on a stove enough times, eventually you will learn not to touch that stove, I think.
It is like, generally, I think human development works more or less that way. And sometimes you need someone to point out that it's the stove that's burning you specifically to give you the little nudge you need to figure out how you can start having different and hopefully better experiences compared to the ones you've been having.
Yeah. And I do wonder if maybe that's a part of where we're at with the toxic gender relationships, just because we were talking about the early days with the blogosphere where I'm very nostalgic for that era of the internet. And, it's cliche to say, but because it's banally true that like, the internet is real life now. And it feels, I realized not realized, but, actually internalized like, wow, the smartphone has been out for like over a decade. And there's kids who had like their developmental cycles happen with that because smartphones came out like just after I graduated high school. So, thank God. And similar, like, I was on MySpace in high school, but other than that, all my like really cringe poetry and stuff like that, probably deleted by now. But I think that's probably that direct feedback loop that a lot of kids are getting is probably pretty difficult.
Yeah, I think it is. It's interesting to see the effect of the smartphone, and some of the sort of internet is forever things you're talking about are interesting for me because it seems clear that a lot of people are sort of end up being haunted by their digital footprint. Whereas I've had multiple blogs. I had a WordPress blog. I had a blogspot blog. I had to go into the Internet Archive within the last like 3 years to pull all of the data from those because they shut down your blog over time. So like, I don't know, there's an interesting parallel of the internet, and my experience of a lot of my internet history is actually that I've lost pieces of internet history that might be nice to look back on. For example, former Twitter accounts that I deactivated and never returned to, or these blogs. And then on the flip side, you have kids who have very easily findable Twitter accounts that are still active, Tumblr accounts that you have plenty of evidence of, so on. I don't know. It's hard for me to make sense of which one matters more for the average person, basically. I don't have an answer for that. Just something that I think about when we talk about sort of internet is forever / smartphones are frying your brains kind of things.
Yeah, that's something that I definitely do. So there's two schools of thought with that. I think sometimes we're like, basically there's a, CIA, NSA, pick your 3-letter agency boogeyman server somewhere that has, essentially your permanent record, which I know in some cases there's like a lot of passive data gathering. But I think maybe a little bit more realistically, unless you're like a public profile it's maybe not necessarily gonna, unless there's a reason to, right? But then that becomes kind of its own problem. Because speaking of Twitter earlier, like I check every now and again just to try to post something if I have something here on Substack. But I've seen like there's that this trend where like anytime like a woman posts a picture, it's like Grok put her in a bikini, and I guess they're trying to like use that to try to legislate X or whatever in Europe and whatnot. But putting that aside, that's kind of what it makes me think of when you have these Grok or OpenAI or whatever, like that this generating porn. It's like you're creating your own like blackmail dossier. You realize that, right? But I think that's going to be really interesting to see, especially in coming years and decades, like especially for people even younger than us who have had this stuff accumulating for years or decades, that everybody just has their own dossier potentially.
It's funny to see how kind of old heads on the internet talk about internet privacy, OPSEC, if you will, and safety, and how the kids do, at least according to my perceptions. There's an old joke that when we were first on the internet, when you still had to listen to dial-up screeching to access the World Wide Web, you were always told never to disclose your location, never to tell people, in some cases, your real name, to be very cautious about who you trusted or talked to on the internet. And I see the joke is that the young people do not have these instincts and do not adhere to these rules. And generally, that has been my experience, even in an age of a Cambrian explosion of pseudonymous accounts, right? It's interesting to see that a lot of what we thought of as wise, safe internet practices aren't really considered wise, safe internet practices anymore. To some extent, that seems probably good. We make more connections from the internet than we used to. The internet is more real life than it used to be, if you will. It lives closer to our actual offline selves than it did when you accessed it through a modem. And at the same time, there's a lot of caution that doesn't seem to be present in internet natives, if you will. And that seems backwards to me, surprising. And I don't know what will become of that practice in the long run.
Yeah. Well, especially because, like I said, like I work in the IT world, sometimes cybersecurity adjacent. There's things you can do, but like as long as you have a modem, you have a smartphone, if they really, it's kind of like, when I see some of these like, more survivalist, like, we're going to have, rebel against the government types. It's okay. It's like, yeah, we have all the guns. It's like, yeah, if they wanted to, they could carpet bomb you. It's a matter of choice. Which, not to be like, you shouldn't do any OPSEC, because like, at least to me, like I'm pseudonymous, not because I'm writing like, 6 million seems like a high number type stuff.
Right.
It's just my first instinct to not put everything out there. And also it's kind of like an ego check, but I think as people become more, especially younger people, become more digitally native. Like I was talking to a friend of mine who's a teacher. She's like, they know how to navigate social media and smartphones really well. But if you give them like a PC and ask them to open up a C drive, they have no idea what they're doing.
I thought about mentioning that, but I was already midway through my ramble and I figured I might not make it back if I did. But it does amuse me that the same concept of millennials are capable of dealing with your bitch ass printer and Zoomers are not seemed to rhyme for me with this concept of digital caution versus YOLO, meet whoever you want on the internet. It's fine.
Yeah, it's definitely an attitude change. But, at least for me, since I work in the IT world, as long as there's printers, I'll have a job, because I think if they're to like train an IT, like not an IT, like an AI agentic thing on how to fix printer, it'd be like the first agentic AI to kill itself. So I think I'm probably good for at least the next little bit.
That's certainly my experience with printers. I can't say I disagree.
Yeah, it's the bane of my existence to this day, but I suppose better than the alternative in this case. But I think this kind of I guess there's something I want to circle back to in a little bit maybe, but another interesting article that you wrote. This is kind of related to what we are talking about. Just when you talk about these things that will stay with you forever. You make one dumb comment or something that is maybe in jest, or you say ironically that it could be taken out of context or taken seriously. We're seeing all these different laws about changing laws on hate speech or censorship, and you wonder if it's going to be applied retroactively or anything like that. And you had this really interesting article about the concept of hate versus dislike, and I think that's a really interesting concept and conversation to have right now, just especially there's all this talk about misogyny or racism, and not that that's not a real thing in some cases, but also I think there's people who use it very cynically and disingenuously, which I think rubs people the wrong way, which can be its own problem. So again, if you want to maybe expand on it, we can kind of jump into that the conversations. In fact, there's some really interesting stuff there.
I'm really glad that one resonated with you. That's one of my favorite articles that I've written for this Substack, which I mentioned today, actually, because I shared it today. I think it is important to do my utmost, at least, to understand people, even when they make me angry, or even when they are doing things that inconvenience me, in part because it's a lot harder to get things done if you don't understand what motivates people, even the ones who are causing problems for you. And I find that I am kind of allergic in temperament to people who want to slap convenient labels on other people in order to make themselves feel better or reduce the complexity of their own moral lives. And I feel that hate is one such thing that often happens. It's not like hate is fake, but a lot of the time people throw around, this person hates me, or this group hates that group, as a kind of shorthand to basically imply that the hated person is a victim of the other person. Because there's sort of this in the water assumption that if someone hates you, unless you've done something egregious, I think in the essay I use the example of murdering someone's whole family. Unless you've done something completely beyond the pale, there's a cultural shorthand that if you hate someone, you're in the wrong and they're a victim of your emotional feelings. So slapping it on other people by saying this person hates me or this person hates people like me, I mean, it can be useful if you don't want to waste time with someone who's not going to be someone you can reason with. That's perhaps a reasonable position. But most of the time, I think people use it because it's convenient, in much the way that people might say, oh, I only have bad experiences with this person because they envy me, for example. Envy, like hate, is real, but that is a suspiciously convenient explanation for having negative outcomes that you're not enjoying. And I think it's usually a lot more useful to get considerably more granular about what's really going on. Because a lot of the time there is a lot more going on than this person is having a vicious emotional experience that makes no sense. And they've directed that emotional experience at this person or this group. How unfair of them. It's just not very useful. Again,
Right.
unless you're saying, I'm not going to bother trying to convince this person or engage with this person, I guess saying they hate me is a way to deal with that. But most of the time, no.
Yeah, well, I think it's in a way kind of like a comforting and or narcissistic thing that, like, you must mean so much to this person that there's they have, because I think a lot of people think like, that's the opposite of love is hate, but really I think the opposite of love is indifference, as I think a lot of people have said. But I think it does, and it feeds into the beginning of our conversation where like it feeds into this discourse that gets kind of totally out of hand. Since it kind of makes me think of, and I'm curious to hear if I'm remembering this correctly from your piece. You said you didn't necessarily consider yourself a feminist, and me growing up and seeing it went from sexist to chauvinist to now misogynist, which is like hatred of women, and it's kind of an interesting thing to me because at least for me personally, like depending on who you ask about this, like I'm either like the most woke chud or the most chuddiest woke person, since I'm not like an anti-feminist person, but I also like don't necessarily take seriously everything to come out of like a women's studies department or HR or HR department or something like that. That having been said, like a lot of the the hatred of women, or at least like the very strong angry rhetoric against it, more than anything, it just kind of takes me aback, just because like that's not been my experience. But I think people will just get in these I don't know, these frames of mind or whatever that will lead to this, and I can see why women would react like that when you see some of this rhetoric, and vice versa. So I don't know, what are your thoughts?
I mean, unfortunately, I am square enough to consider myself a feminist. I'm just
Okay.
lazy enough that feminists who try harder have my goodwill not to claim me as one of their number.
Fair.
I do think I don't have a lot that's good to say about people who, again, when they're dealing with feminism, the way they want to approach negative behaviors they don't like is just to say either that person hates women, or this entire group, if they do X, they hate women. Like, we can definitely find strange, unprepossessing troglodytes who do hate women. That is possible. But for the most part, people who it would be easier if people hated women instead of how they actually feel about them in a lot of cases. Like in a lot of cases, what people feel for women is resentment or frustration that what they want from women isn't easier to get, or frustration at what women do receive for being women that they perceive is unfairly not coming to them because they are not women. There's a lot of granularity in what makes people opposed to feminism. And there's a lot of granularity in what makes basically men behave poorly. That's not always worth examining. There are plenty of psychopaths out there, I guess. But for your average Joe who has grown up in an environment that gave him an impression that feminists genuinely hate him, I don't think, like, while I can say that this same framework applies to him, that he shouldn't just do this, oh, they hate me thing either, I think that engaging with why he feels that way is going to require a lot more of an earnest, good faith feminist than saying, well, you only feel that way because you hate women, and there's nothing we can do, is always an implied asterisk. I just think it's lazy and I don't like it as a way of engaging with problems that come up around feminist ideas and policy.
Yeah, that's usually, it's similar to where I come out on it. Because, just personally, like in my interactions, like it's usually not that I've not had negative interactions with women or really anybody in my life, but usually like what gives me a bad taste in my mouth is, I've heard it called like the bourgeois feminism, HR feminism, like people who have other, especially like people who are otherwise like from upper middle class backgrounds, who use it just to get ahead very cynically. And because, and maybe I don't know, this is like a concept I'm I'm working with, like, because to a certain degree I feel like there's not really any such thing as like woman or man as a group of people, not in like the, the gender deconstructionist sense, but like the idea that you would think of yourself by your sex as a primary identifier is really pretty recent in history, at least, from my understanding. In the Western tradition, it'd be a part of it, but it's not like the primary identity group, like your nation or your ethnicity or something like that. So people who are otherwise well off, who are using it in a cynical way, that's the type of thing that really rubs me the wrong way. But I don't know. What do you think?
I think that it's not surprising that people whose primary idea of feminism is well-off white women holding men's tears mugs and saying that men are trash. It's not surprising to me that those women don't have a lot of fans among men in general. And as I should say that those actions, if that's the major exposure you have to feminism, it doesn't surprise me that a person would find it off-putting, because that's all of the sort of frustration and venting with none of the context for it. And you shouldn't expect people to understand your venting and be sympathetic to it if you're a stranger that they don't know. And similarly, the concept of sort of working in an organization where you feel like you're being managed by people who adhere to this sort of like immature feminine weakness thing that I talk about in my post, where you feel like people are not asking you to be competent, but they're asking you to be empathetic in ways that aren't absolutely necessary to do your job. I also understand why that would be frustrating for the average person. And it seems to me that it's kind of a difficult thing to square in a modern age where everybody a lot of people are out there vomiting their thoughts on the internet, and they're not vomiting thoughts with the idea that they are a mouthpiece for feminism. For example, there aren't women out there thinking, when I tweet men are trash, in the ages when women did that, when I tweet men are trash, I am giving people their first exposure to feminism. But in some cases, that's true.
Sure.
And so you have this problem where people run into negative behaviors that are associated with a group that isn't all negative, which is generally true. And so you get basically negatively polarized by exposure to attitudes that you don't like, people who are often behaving in ways that like a quote unquote true feminist wouldn't approve of. And then you have the kind of corporate feminism, which a lot of classic old school academic feminists also don't have a lot of patience for it. It means that you get a lot of people who feel that they have been exposed to enough feminism to conclude that they don't like it. And in some cases, they're like, that's perfectly reasonable. In all cases, it makes sense to me that people come away with the impressions that they do, or I guess most cases. I don't know.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Sure. And that makes sense. And it kind of makes me think of like, and I've said before, like, I think there's a place for that type of talk. And you call it locker room talk, you're
Right.
venting with the girls, what have you. I don't think it's necessarily a problem in and of itself. I think, the fact that it's online for everybody to see at all times, I do sometimes wonder if, like, we're going to look back at the way we use social media now and essentially reading everybody's mind all the time, like the way we look back at the 50s, everybody smoking all the time. But I guess want to maybe put a finer point on it. Since, believe it or not, I've read like some feminist theory and stuff back in the day, just because I agree with you. I think whether you agree with something or not, you should at least understand what it is conceptually. If you really want, at least like understand it. You don't have to like, if you're an Ayn Rand dyed in the wool capitalist person, you have to read Das Kapital, but you should probably understand what Marxism is, so you don't sound like an idiot when you're calling everything single thing Marxism.
I mean, the Socialist Manifesto is like 4 pages, so for
Yeah,
sure.
it's not that hard. Das
Yeah.
Kapital, I don't think anybody has ever actually read Das Kapital. I've tried. It's really long. There's shorter versions. But
It
in
would
any
be so
case,
cool if I could be like, I have right now, but I have not.
well, you could
Full
definitely lie
disclosure.
about it, because that's, I think most people who say they have read Das Kapital, all the volumes, have lied about it. But anyway, that's kind of what I was getting at, because there's a difference between, because I guess this is my barometer is like, I work in, the IT world, right? So I think it's not quite as pronounced, like the women in tech thing is, at least, I've been doing it for about 10 years. It's not quite as pronounced as it's made out to be by some. It's not quite as enlightened as others would make it either. But the two examples that come to mind is, one time I was new to the industry. I was working like a home like tech install thing, and there's this woman who'd been working there forever. She was so knowledgeable, and there was somebody, funny enough, a woman who was like, well, I just don't want her to do it. I want you to do it. You're a man. You're going to know better. And, she just kind of vented to me after that. And I was like, I just felt so bad, because especially also because I had to be like, yeah, I don't know how to do this. I have to ask her, which is a funny moment. So that's something I have infinite sympathy and support for. Another one was many years later, where I was at a startup where we're starting a meeting, and there's a woman who's like, oh, well, actually a study shows that women are much more likely to take notes, so maybe somebody else should do it. And this is a woman who, made up a job herself that nobody asked her to do or cared about, and then made it a victim thing about women. And that's kind of where my line lies on stuff like that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, this is silly of me, but there's definitely a long time where it baffled me that every woman who appreciated using her brain didn't consider herself a feminist, because at some point, at least, I mean, I've run into many people who thought I was a lot dumber than I actually am in my life. That's my perception. If you want to doubt it, that's fine. Maybe I'm giving myself too much credit, but it's been very frustrating. And experiences like yours, in which there's a woman who definitely has more know-how than a man in the same situation, but is treated as if she has less, is strictly, like, from an average's perspective, understandable, but on an individual level, it pisses you off, and it pisses you off a lot over time. I don't blame you for having a point at which reference to, I'm a woman, I shouldn't have to do this in a public space, is kind of obnoxious. But, like, I don't know. It's funny to hear that story in particular, because I'm sympathetic to a woman who doesn't want to be forced into a secretary role for being a woman. And I also completely understand why, when she made that known in the way that she did, you were extremely turned off and did not think that was appealing or fair at all. And it was kind of an annoying way for her to say that. So I don't know. That is part of why I think it's valuable to do things like you have done, get into the actual theory, figure out what it is that you do and don't agree with, because a lot of annoying people are not necessarily making the worst point in the world,
Yeah, as that old Onion headline goes, it's heartbreaking when somebody you can't stand makes a really good point. And
they be doing that.
They do indeed be doing that. And that's the thing, like, you don't want to do the Jordan Peterson thing of like, well, it depends on what you mean by, but I do think by some definitions, you could definitely call me a feminist, and I just don't necessarily claim it, or just because, I don't know, not be like, oh, I don't like labels, I'm so above it type of way. But I think when you're in the Substack space, I think it kind of puts you in a box where people will be on guard and, reacting in a certain way. So I don't know. It's just, maybe, the degree to which labels in general are helpful is a separate conversation though.
I don't blame the average reasonable person for concluding that feminist doesn't describe them particularly well. I definitely think it describes me. In part, I think it's like important to admit that I choose this obnoxious polarizing label for myself that feels like important disclosure stuff, but I don't think that it's unreasonable for someone to think that feminists made some points, but they aren't a feminist themselves, any more than I think that that's unreasonable for any number of political movements.
Yeah. Well, I think people like to hedge their bets in those situations a lot of the times, or play both sides.
Oh yeah.
Friend of the show, Lurpa Strike, I've had her on a lot of different times. She's been kind of the same as you in the trenches of like the feminist blogger space, since I think she said like, the early mid 2000s or something like that. But I do appreciate the conversation since, it's Substack, and that's kind of part of the reason I wanted to talk to you, since you have more interesting and nuanced views on it. Since, to be frank, if I were like, the anti-feminist type, there's like, 20 different, anti-feminist woman who will say about how terrible feminism is, and how letting women vote was a mistake. Or I could find your prototypical blue-haired, everything is patriarchy, who can yell at me and I can performatively show what a good ally I am by being yelled at. So I think people love that shit to a certain degree, but I think it's more interesting to have a conversation where you just let kind of get it out there.
Obviously, to some extent, I tend to think it's more interesting to have a conversation where you get into specifics, and I think that flat declarations, honestly, this is arguably an annoying bourgeois waspy opinion for me to have, but polarization is annoying to me because it made everyone boring.
Yeah.
No one has interesting things to say anymore because we're not talking in specifics anymore. We're not talking about whether we do agree on X point, but we don't agree on Y point. We're just showing up and saying shit like feminism was a mistake, repeal the 19th. I've seen both of those things a billion times. I have lost interest in the morality or wisdom of them as policy questions because they are so thoroughly repetitive and uninteresting.
It's deeply unserious too. Like, is that really genuinely your solution? We're going to roll back the 19th Amendment and things will, it'll be, white people will be in commercials again. You'll get to have a Chevy and all that shit. It's, commercials. It's a very important part of Western civilization. If you read your, whoever, blanking on whoever the fake, Jeff, Western civilization, inventor of Western civilization. But I think it's interesting you say that, because and it's something you've written about too. And I guess I'm curious to where you stand on this, because again, like I grew up for a long time, it was my instinct to be like, and this was even before I had even read like, at least enough to understand like queer theory, your Judith Butlers, Roxane Gay's, what have you, about, gender being a social construct, performance. Like that's kind of the water that I swam in growing up in the 90s, that like, it wasn't the most important thing about you. And we see at the same time, like this really strange insistence that gender is a total social construct, and you could take a woman and raise her as a boy and she could play boys sports, and it's just totally, because women aren't socialized to be as, athletic, or at the same time, like this hyper gender essentialism that I think you see on, I don't even necessarily put that on one side of the political spectrum or the other. I guess cultural spectrum more so than political. There's just different manifestations of it. But at least to me, like that's kind of what I was getting at earlier when I said I'm either like the most chuddish woke person or the most woke chud, because like I think there is such a thing as differences in sex and gender, and part of it is biology, but I think there's a lot of interplay there. So I guess that's my prerequisite question. Like, where do you come out on that? Because to me, I like you have to be able to like establish these things as a baseline if you want to have honest conversations to actually solve the problems.
I certainly thought, I mean, full disclosure, I have not read My Judith Butler. I have not.
I
But
wouldn't recommend it.
I was certainly aware of a concept of gender as being purely sociological. And I earnestly investigated this concept in part because it really tore me up to imagine that I might be likely to be intellectually inferior on the basis of my gender. So I actually did a lot of scientific reading for the express purpose of figuring out how much evidence there actually was for that. And because of how I felt about the question, I was really not excited about the prospect of learning that it was true. But I felt like it was worth asking the question. And I think it's to take a very bold stance. I think it's reasonable for a feminist to have proposed a theory of what if all the differences we see, the vast majority of the differences we see, you know, like other than genitals, for example, what if they're all socialized? What if there are no psychological differences between men and women? And on investigating that question, I found that I couldn't see data that consistently supported it. And while people can get a little loosey-goosey with what it means that there are gender differences that extend beyond physical dimorphism, there's still a lot of evidence that the way people act has some bearing, has some roots in biology. Now, my particular take on all of this is generally that it is less important why people are the way they are, and more important that a lot of things are changeable. And so which things are worth changing, which things won't have terrible outcomes for changing. And for example, I think women are, to use a hopefully boring example, women cry more often. And I suspect that has some biological component, but not a full biological component. And women have some control over that. And I think that it's, for example, I think I actually have an old tweet where I say something like, it's worth learning not to cry if somebody tells you that you did something harmful to them. That's worth training out of yourself as a woman. And again, it probably is a little bit biological that women are willing to do that more often than men are, but that doesn't mean it's not worth changing or fixing. And so I take a sort of piecemeal approach to which of these things are vulnerable to our intervention and which things do we expect would make the world better to intervene on. And I don't take people particularly seriously if they, for example, believe that the only difference between like men and women in sports is that we raise our boys to do rough and tumble play. But I don't know.
Well, that's the thing that to me, something like that seems, and when I was talking about, gender differences that are kind of innate, like I was talking about more physical. I don't think that there's anything too like intellectual. And sorry, maybe this is a dumb joke. What came to my mind is, you heard that and it's like, doing all this research, like, typical woman reading neuroscience and biology to, try to figure out gender differences,
Women are very invested in these. Men tend to not be, which is its own piece of relevant information.
Which, related, like that's kind of one of my favorite, and that's kind of, I think there are real differences, and they will manifest different ways in different cultures and times, because that's like one of my favorite like Victorian gender stereotypes, that like women are the horny ones and men just like, they're annoyed by them trying to have sex. Like, I just, Margaret, leave me be, I'm trying to read about biology. But in any case, I do think it's interesting and it's real, because I've said before that I feel like women crying in public is like the female equivalent of when guys punch a hole through drywall, just because you got to be in control of yourself a little bit better than that, I think. But it's one of those things where like I do think that it's something that's real and worth noting, but it can be overstated. It's notable like statistically, right? Because of course you have like trying to think of her name, Brock Lesnar's daughter, who looks like Brock Lesnar in a wig, and you have Woody Allen, right? Like that lady can, crush even, Woody Allen in his prime, whatever that would be. So that exists, right?
She could drop kick him, no question. Absolutely.
And maybe he deserves it. I'm not gonna play God. But in any case, like I do think that it's important to be able to have these discussions. And I guess again, maybe that's kind of what I was getting at, that sometimes that particular, not even bourgeois, like the HR feminism, or like you can't have basic conversations, or even, coming more from the right wing side where like it's much more essentialist, since at least to me, like, I've had friends who are trans, and like, wow, when I started taking testosterone or estrogen, literally like the way that I thought is different. And at least to me, like that kind of disproves gender as a complete social construct in and of itself, ironically, because I think like, how intelligent you are, I'm not sure how much I buy into IQ is like, like you roll up a D&D character and you get a certain amount of intelligence when you're born. I do think a lot of it is environmental, but the way that your intelligence and your curiosity, all these things are going to be filtered through innumerable different filters, sex or gender just being one of them, culture, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I don't know. It's interesting trying to piece apart. And for me, I have to confess that while there's definitely writing about gender that I find extremely off-putting, the idea that because something is about gender, it's likely to be slop is sort of a foreign concept to me, because it's genuinely an interesting set of questions about what it means to be human, what it means to inhabit the world with a particular experience of the world, and the fact that there are these two bimodal distributions for most gendered traits, and that you can be far to one tail or the other in either bimodal distribution. It makes for a really, really interesting aspect of humanity. And because I've long been interested in understanding what it's like to look out through other people's eyes as individuals, I find the concept of gender a really fascinating one, just on so many levels, whether it's biological or psychological, sociological, because it tells me something about what it's like to experience life in a way that I personally never have. And while there are certainly people who write silly things about it, and people who write things that I think are making the world worse about it, in a lot of cases, there's a lot to learn even from stuff that I find offensive or annoying, because it does still contain information about what it's like to be someone who's different from me.
Yeah, I would agree there. And I say gender slop kind of playfully there. I don't think any
I'm not trying to diss you, I promise.
Okay. No, okay.
I promise.
Well, I have this the curse of trying to over clarify myself like that. But I know what you mean. It's kind of like, there's a big difference between like, Miles Davis and like, Muzak kind of shitty jazz that you hear in an elevator, or whatever your pastiche is that you want to go with. But I think it touches on something interesting. And that's kind of what I was getting at, because I'm kind of the same way, where like I want to, I want to, for better or for worse, sometimes to my detriment, I want to understand as much of the world as I can. And I think to do that, you have to listen to, at least to understand the perspective that somebody's coming from, and read
Yeah.
something that you might not even like or agree with, but I want to understand it. And one of the other things that you kind of wrote about, at least orthogonally, at least for my interpretation of it, is like, and maybe it was related to like, the hate versus dislike, but it is important to make a distinction between, okay, what is a uncomfortable conversation versus what is hateful. Since, this is very much in the news right now. Like, when you're talking about something like immigration, for example, I'm not like a send them all back type, but I think realistically, like, there are differences between cultures, and you need to have realistic and sober conversations of different cultures who have different values are going to live in the same space in a democracy. And for some people, that's like, oh my God, you've gone too far. And for other people, like, oh no, you're not going far enough. But at least to me, be it gender or different cultures or what have you, like, you do need to be able to sit there and be sober and have that conversation. But and you definitely can cross into bigotry, but at the same time, you can be too avoidant and not wanting to have that conversation. If you're going to use an interpersonal metaphor, like if you never talk about Aunt Sally's drinking, then then she'll crash your car into a wall.
Yeah, I think one of the most valuable traits, abilities that a person can develop, especially if they're interested in ideas, in other people, and or in policy, is the ability to have a conversation about something that makes you feel frustrated or uncomfortable or unhappy, and learning to prioritize exchanging information over that discomfort. And I generally think that having the capacity to do that makes basically everyone a better person to deal with, an easier person to engage with, and it makes them as an individual better off and more capable of getting things done. And I think I think it's very human and very natural. I've certainly noticed this in myself, to have this idea that if you dislike it, you get to discard it. If it makes you feel uncomfortable, you can just throw it away. And there's obviously a point at which that's true. Obviously, I'm not here for open your mind so far that your brain falls out, but I'm definitely a fan of learning to sit with reasonable discomfort and hear people out who see things differently than you, and learn to recognize that you don't actually have to agree with someone to treat them well in a conversation where you take different positions, even if they're saying things that you don't like. And I think that's a better approach than indulging a desire to discard things that bother you, because I think that is risky for all kinds of relationships, whether it's interpersonal ones or national relationships.
Yeah. And I think that's kind of maybe where leadership is lacking more broadly right now. It's, at least to me, I think the whole, like, open your mind so broadly that your brain falls out, like you said. I think there's a lot of that right now, where, because there is such a thing, I think of it as like, the very, like, what would you call, like, Reddit coded, like you're just trying to be so open-minded that you essentially just kind of go with whatever the popular thing is, or you change your mind all the time. Like, it was a meme for a while where, like, you see, somebody makes like a video or a blog post of, like, my political journey, and they're just so all over the place. Like, they start as, ANCOM, and then, become communist, and then they're a Nazi, and now they're a, gay, furry Nazgul or whatever. I was like, this is not really connected to anything in real life. Because I think you can be obsequious to the point where you don't actually get anything done and you don't really stand for anything.
Oh, yeah. I wish I could sum it up into one neat and tidy rule, a bright line. But it does seem to me that that a lot of the most valuable abilities in dealing with other people involve balancing two competing values, at least two. And in this case, it seems to me that changing your mind when you learn new information is extremely good. And thus being able to seek out information that challenges you and change your mind when you run into information that suggests to you what you've believed is not accurate is really important. And that must be balanced with a temptation to bandwagon every persuasive speaker that you ever run into. And I have a sort of, I feel like I'm giving myself too much credit if I'm like, oh, this is an Aristotelian idea of mine, but like there is a sort of golden mean approach to values that I do put a lot of stock in. And in this, as in a lot of other cases, being able to find moderation between two extremes that both have their own virtues is a better way to go. The best way to go if you can manage it. And there's always going to be some tension in managing it, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the question of our moment to a certain degree right now. This because it's one of the other things I wanted to talk to you about is, it sounds like you either, professionally, at least in your interest, are in the, the math and science worlds. And that's kind of, there's been like all this questions about, common sense versus the experts. Like, nobody trusts the experts anymore. And I think there are reasons to defer to quote unquote the experts, and there are reasons to be distrustful of them. And I think that kind of, because it seems like we're both kind of like right brain people in that sense, or because I'm probably a lot more of a logical person. Much to her chagrin, I joke to my wife sometimes, like, I need sometimes 2 to 3 business days to process something emotionally, just because that's how my brain works. And like, all right, I'll give you the report after I mull it over. But it is something that it feels like that we're dealing with as a society right now, since, without getting into, you can pick your conspiracy and or, cultural moment that I'm sure we can all think of in the last couple of years, why people all have become more and more distrustful of the experts or science, or, as an institution that is. And, also the other side of the coin being like this very populist kind of, libidinal short-term thinking that we're seeing right now, and trying to like find a good, I don't even want to say middle ground, because that implies like, you could just, if you could just all be sensible centrists, we could find the right answer. But clearly, like, there's an interplay between all of this.
Yes. My position on the concept of the right meta between trust the experts and use your common sense is generally that you're probably going to be worse off if your standard approach to an expert is they're probably wrong because they're an expert. I don't think that's ideal for just about anyone. However, I support people in their desire to vet experts and their desire to ensure that experts, elite institutions, academia is producing information that they can trust. And there's an informed skepticism that I think makes people better off, that I wish I saw more of in people who were reflexively distrustful of institutions. I think there has been a tendency to be harsh on institutions for being imperfect when they're a lot better than not having those institutions at all. And I think a lot of people have come to very much the wrong conclusion about what the best local minimum is for that positioning, even if the experts are obviously wrong at least some of the time. There is a replication crisis. There are papers that you shouldn't trust. There are papers that are done with bad methodology, and there are papers that are done with passable methodology that wouldn't replicate if you tried. There's more than one reason to be skeptical. I'm very, very encouraging of people being armed with basic heuristics that will make it more likely for them not to hurt themselves if they're going to apply skepticism. Because I tend to be a little paternalist in that way. I'm not nearly sorry enough about it. But I do think it's important that if you are going to doubt experts, you really learn what it is that makes an expert worth listening to and what makes them not worth listening to. And if you don't have the ability to do that, you are often better off just trusting experts.
Yeah,
Common sense does go a decent way, though.
Yeah, it's a difficult skill to learn. Because like the example that comes to my mind is like, for example, like if you look at like, pick your LLM, ChatGPT, Grok, I'm far from the first one to make the joke of, it's this magical box that knows everything about topics that you don't know anything about, but is only like 60 to 70% there about something you know anything about. And it kind of reminds me of like, be it any of this stuff when you're talking about experts or tech or anything. Like the first time when I was a kid, I really remembered my dad telling me something that I knew for sure was wrong. And
Oh, yeah.
it shook my little world for sure. And I think a lot of people end up in that situation. And I'm glad you brought up the replication crisis, because if you want to speak on that a little bit, because I'm kind of a little bit more agnostic. And I guess I'm also a little bit, this is maybe also one of my more popular opinions, that I think some paternalism is good. And I think a lot of people can't handle total freedom and they do need a little bit of guidance, but that's maybe a different conversation if you want to get into that as well. But like when you talk about the replication crisis, and I'll let you speak to that because it sounds like it's more your field, but like at least I was talking, I had him on my podcast, a friend of mine who's a doctor, and he's like, it's not something that's across the board, like different types of science or medicine. It's not an undifferentiated thing when you're talking about like the hard sciences. The problem is peer review versus the lack of replication, or looking where funding is coming from. Whereas like in the I don't necessarily want to say soft sciences, but the social sciences is where the replication crisis really becomes problematic. So I don't know. What are your thoughts if am I off base on that, since that's not necessarily my wheelhouse, but I've talked to people who it is theirs.
That maps to my broad experiences with a lot of there's a lot of variation by field in how well things replicate, how well the average paper replicates, I should say. And it is true that the hard sciences tend to have less of a problem than the soft sciences. It is technically true that doesn't mean you can reflexively assume that anything published in the Journal of Material Science, anything published even in a big journal like Science or Cell or the New England Journal of Medicine is definitively accurate, would definitively replicate. But knowing the actual sources of the information that you're dealing with is a good start, because different journals have higher standards than other journals do, and the harder sciences tend to have standards according to the statistics and methodology that they will accept, that makes them at least marginally more trustworthy. Psychology is the classic example of a field that has a major replication crisis. It is something like more than 50% of papers that don't replicate. And a lot of the methodology in psychology is sort of unavoidably difficult to tie back to the questions it's trying to answer. So it doesn't surprise me, frankly, that in a field where designing studies that actually tackle what you're looking to study, you don't see a lot of ability to show the same thing over and over again. Basically, I get torn in talking about this for a lay audience because I think that well-applied skepticism will make a person better off, and a carte blanche to be skeptical of anything produced by any scientific body is catastrophic in the hands of the wrong person. And so it's hard to find a way to say there are all of these criticisms of the sciences, including the hard sciences, and the way they produce and publish papers that are true. There are all these criticisms you can make about, I mean, like not only the replication crisis, but problems like p-hacking, outright fraud are real problems that do show up sometimes even in the highest halls of the hard sciences. We're talking Nobel winners who have had their medals revoked for fraud. That is real, but if you give people that information and you tell them this is a good reason for you to believe that you can't trust academic science, you are being irresponsible. You should do your best work to try to doubt wisely, and you would be better off not doubting medicine than doubting everything medicine has ever produced. But
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe this is another of these. I don't want to say it's Aristotelian and middle ground, because I don't think it's wise to say I'm just going to accept 50% of the scientific information that I hear. I don't think that's going to leave a person particularly well off. But I don't know. People are going to do what they're going to do. A problem for paternalists everywhere.
Yeah. Well, it kind of makes me think of, I was listening to something. I'm trying to think of who it was. There was this guy who was talking about the attitude of like the Chinese government versus the U.S. government for, quote unquote, trusting the experts. And he was like, this guy was more pro China. It's like, well, in China, they don't ever say that the experts are wrong. They will just say like, oh, you're right, but we're not going to listen to you. Whereas in the U.S., we'll say, the experts are wrong and fake. Because at least to me, like that's kind of I don't know, it's a distinction without a difference. That's kind of a weird type of chauvinism. But I do think that sometimes the framing matters, because like I'm not like a they're putting chemicals in the water that are making the frogs gay kind of guy. But it is one of those things where I will, the dreaded, do your own research. When you look at, especially like, to me, like the medical industry is one that it's something at this point I try not to think about, because I'll think about, like funding for research that will overwhelmingly, surprise, surprise, yield the results that those, the ones that are funding their research want. And it's usually from those industries. And that's where it does get a little bit hairy for me, where I don't know, because again, like common sense versus trust the experts, these are such loaded terms. It's something I'm kind of working on writing right now, because I think sometimes it's good to be able to trust institutions, but I think people have very good reasons to not trust institutions sometimes. And to me, like my litmus test is, that I think it became something of a meme, especially during the COVID years, of like, trust the science became like a pejorative thing for some people. And to a certain degree, I do get it, since my litmus test was like, if you were to say trust the science or experts or scientists, replace any of those with, replace science with the church or priests or God. And if it's like an authoritative claim of, trust, capital T, capital S, the science, without really giving a lot of evidence, then I feel like, that's you're good to be a little bit skeptical, but if, according to XYZ study done in ABC University, they found 1, 2, 3 results, that to me feels a little bit more sound than like these, especially in regards to like the social sciences, whether or not you believe in it. I remember seeing something like, criticizing trans people is an attack on science, which, putting aside that whole can of worms, that framing is like a very disingenuous way to put it, I think.
Yeah. I guess so first of all, on the question of funding, definitely, I actually think that the public perception of funding sources as having a warping effect on research is borrowed from things like nutrition data, in part, which is notoriously unreliable as a data set. It's very difficult to get, as I understand it, good data on what people eat without literally putting them in a box and controlling what comes in and out. So nutrition is notoriously unreliable. And so you do get these sort of questionable studies that are funded by questionable organizations that have predictable outcomes. I would say that anything that studies that come more out of industry are worth looking twice at, but not necessarily guaranteed to be questionable on their own just because they're industry. And especially, again, knowing the level of confidence you can have in a particular field is useful. Funding is not, in my experience, as much of a warping effect on academic research, at least not in the way that a lot of people's heuristics seem to work. Funding has grant-funded organizations have their own problems that I could talk about at length, but it doesn't usually look like some guy in a suit showing up with like drug pens and getting you to say that his particular recombinant antibody is guaranteed to cure cancer or whatever. It really is not like that in academic research, in my experience. And then on the broader question of the trust the experts and how to actually make good decisions when it comes to skepticism over trust, I'm definitely understanding of the concept of being wary that someone told you to trust an institution basically blindly. I don't think it's wise to be, I understand being upset about the idea that you should just trust an institution wisely, because you can't trust almost any group of people to do anything perfectly. So it's reasonable that if you have a reason to suspect that something's going wrong, to investigate further rather than telling yourself that you're probably in the wrong. I think if you want to play, I don't trust academic science, you better be armed with information that allows you to make clear designations between good science and bad science. And that's going to mean familiarizing yourself with everything from the journal that it comes from, methodological concerns that can help you suss out good reports from smaller journals, which those of course exist too, to understanding which field you're dealing with and the likelihood of getting a report that isn't replicated, learning some things about statistics. If somebody shows up and gives me a good methodological argument for doubting a particular study, in some cases I might think they're nitpicking, because people do that. But in a lot of cases, I'm going to assume that that person knows enough to play a serious skeptic. If someone says, I don't trust the science because someone told me to, and no, I have no idea what JAMA is, it does frustrate me a little bit that some combination of institutional trust and their environment of information has given them reason to believe that they have enough information to start discarding institutional trust left and right. Like, skepticism should not be something you do blindly any more than trusting institutions is. You've got to know what you're doing.
That's I think I'm gonna have to quote you on that one. That's a really good turn of phrase there. And
Thank
I
you.
would I would agree with you broadly there. And for and again, sorry if I'm over clarifying. Yeah, whenever it's like, trust the science just blindly, to me, that strikes me differently than, like I said, here is what this study, this university said. Because I think that's become like, I think it was like an XKCD comic years ago. I don't know. Seems like maybe that'd be up your alley of like, the I fucking love science types where it's like, yeah, do you love science or do you just think looking at space is cool? And to me, that's where the distinction draws, because maybe this is like I'm just a little bit too cynical in that sense. Like, and I think probably you're right that my distrust comes from like the food and drug side of things. Just it's you could I could be very lazy and cite like smoking was said to be healthy by doctors for years. You could sugar or what pick whatever lobbyist group. That's the type of thing that will rub me the wrong way. But again, like it's at this point, it's kind of like a received wisdom thing. So I'm kind of agnostic on that. But I do think it's an interesting conversation to have. But I actually do have one more topic for you, if you're okay for time. Otherwise, we could wrap it up. That you made me think of.
Oh yeah, no, let's
So
do it.
yeah, so you mentioned being, the concept of being more paternalistic, and I think that's something that is like very antithetical to, at the very least, like the American character. And that's I'm wondering what you mean by that and what your thoughts are. And it's something that I feel like is probably one of my more genuinely unpopular views that seems to get pushback from everybody. Well, not everybody, because don't want to make it sound like I'm self-victimizing, but like for example, like I remember what's his face, Zoran Mamdani, like everybody was going after him because he said something about the warmth of collectivism rather than rugged individualism. And at
Yeah.
least to me, like, be it in a corporation or an army or in scientific research, you have to be collectivist to a degree to accomplish these things. You can't be, otherwise you just be a hunter gatherer tribe, who they don't really build anything really, as much as the social scientists of a certain bent that was very popular, and I feel like a decade ago, to say that they were the ideal society. But they don't even invent, they're not inventing penicillin to have these conversations over, much less like houses with more than one story. But all that to say, I feel like everybody loves to think of himself as a rugged individual, kind of almost regardless of your political stripe sometimes. And all that to say, like, my more maybe unpopular view is, like, I think a lot of times people can't handle that level of freedom all the time, and some kind of paternalism is necessary. But what are your thoughts as far as, like, the experts or paternalism, or however you want to put that?
I guess I've spent a lot of time around people who are in the neighborhood of libertarian in the last few years. I would describe my wife as fairly libertarian, for example, in temperament. And compared to libertarians, I am paternalist. I tend to think that there is, again, a productive tension, as there is with evaluating truth, as there is with getting to know people. There's a productive tension between belonging and autonomy. And this is one of the reasons why I actually think marriage as a concept, as a dynamic, is a really interesting thing to try to understand, is that marriage is one of the smallest units of study you can have about the tension between autonomy and belonging. And I think people who are really drawn to autonomy and to a concept of never needing other people are a bit amusingly optimistic about the human project, because we are, after all, social primates. we're pretty programmed to need each other. And perhaps the explosion of populism and collectivist ideals that we've seen in the past few years is partially a result of the fact that we are all increasingly atomized. We spend so much time alone in our houses, on our phones, on our devices, and we spend much less time with other people than we used to. We do need other people, including to save us from ourselves sometimes. And where I tend to sound, I think a position that is easy for me to take on paternalism is that a person who genuinely has autonomy will not be harmed by someone else attempting to be paternalist to them. Like if you actually are self-possessed enough that you don't need other people's input, then you are also not going to be driven off course by paternalism. If you are driven off course by paternalism, then an argument that paternalism is bad is usually actually rooted in, I don't think you should tell them to do that, rather than, I don't think anyone should tell them what to do. Ultimately, if you are vulnerable to the opinions of other people in a way that detracts from your autonomy, there is a level of development that you haven't reached, that it would be better for you to have a good mentor to help you through that than to follow the whims of anyone who finds you. And that does make me a paternalist to some people, but I don't take people very seriously if they think paternalism is universally bad, because a strong enough individual will not care either way if they are imposed upon by someone who tries to tell them what to do. And I think a lot of the people who have a knee-jerk response to paternalism are telling on themselves a little bit, because being bothered by other people having opinions about what you say is not a sign of secure autonomy and knowledge that the buck stops with you, and that choices you make are entirely your purview, and that nothing anybody else tells you to do, short of, like legally, has meaningful power over you. You get to decide what you do. If other people think you should do something different, they're not hurting you. So I don't tend to be as sympathetic to critics of paternalism as I feel like I should be, but it is because I believe that the concept of paternalism being bad comes from people who aren't good at throwing off paternalism themselves, and that is not a positive, and that is their job to fix.
No, I like it. It's good to have something that's genuinely a little bit off the beaten path, because I think a lot of people don't like to hear that. And I would, because I used to be somebody who was much more of a a libertarian when I was like a teenager and whatnot, but I had a very very religious upbringing and stuff, so I think a lot of it was very very reactive. But I think again, this is, maybe it sounds very callous, but I think a lot of people don't have what it takes to truly be autonomous and have agency. Like right off the back, it sounds shitty to say, but there's a certain portion of the population that just doesn't have a high enough IQ to really be agentic. And I don't mean that in any of the I'll just head that off, the race realist way types. I just think there's a certain portion of the population who just are just going to have an IQ that's not high enough to really truly be self-sufficient. And I think kind of that you could see that in a lot of different ways. We have this romantic idea of the psychopath as Dexter or Hannibal Lecter, but most psychopaths are in jail for petty crime because they don't have enough self-control to really have agency. Or I think when you talk about the Aristotelian or the paternalistic side, I don't know if you read that chick on Substack, Ayala. I know people have a lot of feelings about her. My biggest criticism of her is she is a very attractive woman, and a very intelligent woman who's seemingly fairly well off. Her advice is not going to be good for most people. And I think most people would be better off in, monogamous relationships. But again, that's I don't know. It sounds more conservative, I guess, but I mean, I don't really even know how that tracks to the political compass anymore. But that's definitely and one more thing, and I'll throw it back to you. Like, I think if I would be pro censorship if we had like a truly like on social media, for example, when I go on Twitter, X, I guess, if there was somebody who had a steady hand at the wheel, who's just like, across the board, you can't make racial epitaph type comments. You can't do threats of violence across the board, but be it the old ownership or the new ownership, clearly a thumb is on the scale. But the problem, and it kind of links back to what we're talking about, trusting the experts, is, we don't have, I think, elites or people who can really, truly have a truly paternalistic attitude towards it, and people are using it in very petty ways.
Yeah, I definitely take a different tack on the concept of there are people who are fundamentally incapable of agency, and that might just be because I'm too optimistic about people. It wouldn't be the first time that I was accused of that. But broadly, I definitely think that people benefit from guardrails and from the kind of structure that other people necessarily provide. That's a basic principle of parenting, that children are much better off when they know what the limits are and they know exactly what happens when they do X, Y, or Z. But there's also like a societal analog for that. In fact, what a very old piece of mine, very old. This is at least 2 years or a year and a half ago now, that I wrote about feminism as it affects men. And one of the things that I think that feminism has done that has destabilized men is that it has taken away a really clean, obvious way for them to show up and follow rules and get an outcome that they were expecting. There's this concept, like, I personally believe that gender roles are sort of for men's benefit. It is, here is your X, here is your Y, here is what you do, and as long as you do this, everything will work out fine. Feminism,
we do like that. You're right.
They do. Like, and there's nothing wrong with liking a good sense of what is expected of me, to be clear. It's interesting that feminism tore up that old script, and with it, a lot of men's understanding of what their job was. And that doesn't necessarily mean, in my opinion, that doesn't mean that feminism was wrong to tear up that script. But it also doesn't surprise me that men find themselves adrift as a result. I don't know how to replace that script precisely, but it is one of many examples I can think of where I think people really need social guardrails. They need an understanding of where they're supposed to go and what they're supposed to do. And having a safe, basic script to slot into is a pretty important fallback for most people, I would say, including a lot of pretty smart people and a lot of pretty open people. Having a concept of, it wouldn't be so bad if you got married and had a couple kids and had a normal job after going to college. That's pretty good for a lot of really capable people, and not just for any, like, if there is an underclass that is incapable of agency, they may need that script, but clearly the smart people do too. So I tend to be supportive of at least having cultural and institutional ways for people to make sense of where they stand, and enough space for people to riff on that or go their own way without being crucified, unless they're really, really causing problems, I suppose.
Yeah, and that makes sense. And I do want to say, like, I don't think, some people need to be wards of the state, but, some, I guess technically, like, at the very far end of the bell curve, like, some people literally do. But, like, I mean, there was a guy I remember working with years ago where, like, he was the nicest guy in the world, but he just wasn't a very smart guy. And if you gave him very specific tasks and very specific instructions, he was great. He could do that all day. But if it was outside of that, he definitely would get frustrated and have a hard time with it. And I think like socially, I think that's very important too, especially for men, but I think in different ways for women too. I think in different ways. It's something I was thinking about, like, there's, and I'm pretty agnostic on the whole thing, but I know this is maybe too big of a topic to, I'm just bring it up. We don't have to get into it because, it's been close to 2 hours, but we're talking about like the fertility crisis. If we're talking about like, and you've talked about it as like, it's a marriage problem rather than a fertility problem. And I do think like, we're in some ways more free, but is like the average person really better off? Like, the guy who can, watch porn and play video games all the day, you technically have more freedom, but are you better off than your grandpa? Same thing, like, if there's a woman who, you have all the freedom, you can have the job and you can get out there and do whatever you want. Are you better off than your grandma who got married at, 18 and had 5 kids? I think that's a sliding scale. And that's, again, something that's maybe uncomfortable. There are your ALAs and your very smart people who can handle that. But I think a lot of people, male or female, literally just can't handle that. And, I'm not a Jordan Peterson guy, but I did think a little while back before he went super, super crazy, he said something about enforced monogamy. And, I was like, maybe there's imperfect messenger, but there is something to be said for some of these social norms being enforced socially rather than like, a puritanical top down, you get branded with a red A, if that makes sense.
Yeah. It seems clear to me that there are massive benefits to there being a kind of boring path that is acceptable to a lot of people, that works for a lot of people, and just enough space for people who really want to go off it to do something else. And that does, to my mind, include things like helping people couple up more. I do think, I say this, I think there's a role for society to play in making it easier for people to couple up more. I don't know what that is. I don't know exactly how I think that should work, but I like to believe that since society and, some of our scientific approaches changed, we could find a way to sort of fix some of the negative second and third order effects that we have that have led to people coupling up less. I don't think most people aren't happy about that, to be honest.
Yeah.
And I've certainly written a little bit about that, but I think there's a lot of value in people having a sense for what's expected of them and a sense for how they can act within their sphere and within their abilities to achieve things that they reasonably want.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's just a recurring theme in this conversation. It's an ongoing conversation, and it seems like, at least from the impression I'm getting from you, you have a similar personality to me. Like the instinct is to be like, all right, let's find a unified theory of everything. But I think it's going to be a process of just kind of figuring it out as we go along, since I think there's been massive social and technological changes, basically throughout all of history. And I think it does kind of feel like the smartphone and the internet, it's been kind of an order of magnitude different, but what is the other side of that being, I don't want to be too authoritarian. Like, your other options are either banning Twitter or, Soviet style nationalizing the dating apps, which I think would probably be equally as disastrous. And it's just going to be a process. And maybe it'll just be at a certain point, we'll be like, all right, this is kind of negative and has a lot of bad downstream effects for society, and people just kind of naturally move away from it. But I guess we'll see how things play out.
Yeah, it will be, I don't know. I'm worried and unsure about what the next 5, 10, and 20 years will bring in a world that is rapidly changing so often, but I'm definitely curious about where we're going to end up. Intrigued to see where we go from here.
Same here. I'm one of these people where like I think if we can get through like the next 10 to 20 years, it'll probably work itself out. But there's a non-zero chance that we blow ourselves up or, make some horrible decisions that have terrible knock-on effects. But, what's the, that possibly apocryphal, like, Chinese curse of may you live in interesting times. And we're definitely living in interesting times.
No question.
But so we've been going about 2 hours, so I don't want to take up too much more of your time. I just want to say, thanks a lot for coming on. Do you have any closing thoughts though before we get into plugs and promotions and all that?
I think it's been a really interesting conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with me. I'm glad that you thought of me to have a discussion because it's valuable and interesting for me to talk to people who have different perspectives on any number of things than I do.
Yeah, likewise. It's definitely it was definitely a productive conversation, I think. But I guess my second to last question then is like, speaking of which, of your work, which I enjoy, do you have any plugs, promotions? Do you have anything coming up in the near future you want to tell the audience about?
I so wish I had scheduled something big and splashy for shortly following the release of this. I will be doing my typical writing, 4 posts a week, Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday. And I can be found on Eurydice Live Substack and obviously occasionally on Twitter.
Yeah. Well, and also shout out to you for how prolific you are. I've gotten myself where like I can do 2 things a month, but like my writing style is just like I need to like read 3 books and I'm trying to get to like 2,000 words. My last one was 3,500 and it was
nice.
But that's something I admire about you and anybody who can be prolific like that, where you release more regularly. But in any case, the last question I have is for you before we end is the question I ask all the guests and the show. It's we didn't get too into doom and gloom today, but that having been said, the world is a little crazy right now. So what's something that makes you feel hopeful for the future? Or if you don't have anything off the top of your head, what's something that would?
I think that the fact that people are increasingly having more granular conversations, even just in my circles, even if that's something I'm seeing that isn't happening in a lot of places, I'm very encouraged to see that people are speaking less in siloed terms and trying to get more specific about what they agree on and disagree on. I'm very hopeful to be able to understand each other better as a nation, because frankly, I worry about the state of the country, including just how people engage with one another. But I also am hopeful for better leadership, better outcomes, better scientific exploration discoveries downstream of having more interesting conversations. That is very optimistic of me, but it is something that genuinely makes me hopeful.
Well, I hope so too. So with that, thank you so much for coming on. This has been a lot of fun.
Thank you. Same here.
All right, have a good one.
You too.